Welcome to 929 Chapters. I'm your host, David Z. Moster, PhD and Rabbi, and today I have a very exciting topic for you. What we're going to be doing is getting under the hood of Genesis chapter 5, something usually reserved for PhD and Doctorate of Theology students in universities and seminaries. But we're going to be doing this today for the first time on YouTube. This video is going to be broken up into 4 parts. I'm going to begin with a summary and outline of the chapter, then I'm going to give you my comment, then we're going to read some select verses in Hebrew and in English, and then finally I'm going to leave you with a photo about the chapter. So let's begin with the summary and outline of Genesis chapter 5. I broke this chapter into 2 parts, an introduction in the first 2 verses and a genealogy in the rest of the chapter. Now I'd like to point out 3 interesting things about the introduction. It begins with the word Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam. This is the book of the generations of man. This is important because the word Toldot, generations, appears a number of times in the book of Genesis. And there are actually 11 passages that have this phrase, and many people like to break up the entire book of Genesis according to this phraseology, that every time the word Toldot appears, it's a new section. For more on this, you can see the introduction to the book of Genesis, the video, here on YouTube. The second point I would like to make about the introduction is that this is the first time that the man is called by a name. His name is Adam, whereas in the previous chapters he was called Ha-Adam, the man. And the hey at the beginning of the word in Hebrew means the word the in English. The third point I would like to make is that for those reading the Hebrew text, things all of a sudden get confusing because we now have a person named Adam and we also have the word for mankind, Adam. So it's not clear exactly who is being referred to at each point in the text. However, what is clear is that Adam, probably mankind, is created in the image of God and also has male and female. There's no mention of Eve here, and that these people were blessed by God himself. That's the introduction, verses 1 to 2. Now let's take a look at the genealogy in verses 3 to 32. And this genealogy gives us the first 11 generations of mankind. The first generation is Adam. The second generation is Seth. Third generation is Enosh. The fourth generation is Canaan. The fifth generation is Mahalalel. The sixth generation is Jared. The seventh generation is Chanoch, Enoch. The eighth generation is Methuselah. The ninth is Lamech. The 10th is Noah, and the 11th is Shem, Ham, and Yafet, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now there's more to this genealogy than just these names. For example, the 7th generation, Enoch, we are told that he walked with God and was no more, which basically means that he died young. But perhaps more importantly, there are a number of numbers in this genealogy. Many numbers. Let's take a look at them. For each person, we are told the years that they lived until their first child. Then we are told the years that they lived after their first child. And then we are told this total lifespan. So, for example, when it comes to Methuselah, we are told that Methuselah lived 187 years until his first child. Then we are told that he lived 782 years after his first child. And finally, we are told that he lived 969 years in total. So this is done for every single person in this chapter. Now, this is already a lot of numbers. However, there are even some hidden numbers that lay behind the chapter that we're going to even explore further in the comment. But let me just point them out here. Because we know how old Adam was when he first had a kid, and how old his son was when he first had a kid, and so on and so forth, we can calculate the year that every single person was born, the year from creation. Next, once we know the year the person was born, we can calculate the year that a person died from creation. And finally, since we know the year that Noah was born, and that the flood took place in the 600th year of Noah's life, we can calculate the year of the flood from creation. So, for example, our friend Methuselah, we can tell that he was born in the year 687 of creation. He died in the year 1656 of creation, and that actually happened to be the year of Noah's flood, 1656. So Methuselah probably died in the flood itself. So using these kinds of numbers, we can find some hidden numbers that lay behind the text, such as when the person was born, when the person died, and if that person died in the flood or not. Let's move on to part 2, the comment. Now, we don't have the original text of Genesis 5. The closest thing we have are what we call textual witnesses. Now, these are very old versions of Genesis, and these can give us a snapshot of what the book of Genesis looked like in the Second Temple period, a few centuries before the Common Era. Now, we're going to deal with 3 witnesses today. The first one is the Masoretic Text, MT for short. This is the standard versions that we all use today. The second one is the Samaritan Pentateuch, SP for short. short, and this is the version used by a group of people known as the Samaritans. The third witness is the Septuagint, LXX for short. LXX is a Roman numeral for the number 70, and that's just a reference to the tradition that there were 72 Israelites that translated the Septuagint from Hebrew into Greek. The Septuagint was the first translation of the Bible. It was written by the Jews of Alexandria, and it's a translation into Greek. Now, there's a reason we're going to be looking at these three witnesses. They are very different from each other. Now, all the people in the genealogy are the same. The order of the generations are the same, but the major difference comes to those numbers. And as we just saw, there are a lot of numbers in Genesis chapter 5. So let's take a look at one example, our friend Methuselah. According to the Masoretic text, Methuselah lived 187 years when he had his first child. According to the Samaritan Pentateuch, he was age 67 when he first had a child. And according to the Septuagint, he was 167 when he first had a child. Now, the second years of Methuselah's life. According to the Masoretic text, he was 782. According to the Samaritan Pentateuch, he was 653, and according to the Septuagint, he was 802. And then for the total years of his life, the Masoretic text and the Septuagint end up at 969, but they got there in different ways. And the Samaritan Pentateuch has him living at 720 years. Now, let's look at the year of his death. The year of his death, according to the Masoretic text, was 1656, the year of the flood. According to the Samaritan Pentateuch, 1307, the year of the flood in the Samaritan Pentateuch. And according to the Septuagint, the year 2256, which was about the year of the flood in the Septuagint. We can see that there were major differences between each and every version. Now, rather than going through each of these numbers individually, which would take a very, very long time, what I'm going to do here today is try and show you the logic behind each of these three witnesses. What makes the Masoretic text unique, what makes the Samaritan Pentateuch unique, and what makes the Septuagint unique. So let's begin with the Masoretic text. The earliest versions we have of the Masoretic text are the Aleppo Codex, shown here from the year 930, or the Leningradic Codex, shown here from the year 1008 of the Common Era. These are only the full versions, or almost full versions, of the Masoretic text. But the Masoretic text can even be found in texts from the Judean desert, meaning not in Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, but near Qumran. And these come from the first few centuries before the Common Era. One of these places is the well-known fortress of Masada. And what we're looking at here is from the Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library. It's a version of the Masoretic text, what we call the Proto-Masoretic text, and it was found at Masada, and this is from the book of Leviticus. So we have parts of the Masoretic text from very ancient sources, but the first complete versions of the Masoretic text come from the Middle Ages. Let's take a look at the Masoretic text. According to this text, the flood occurs in the year 1656. Nobody outlives the flood, hence Methuselah dies in year 1656. Methuselah, not Adam, is the longest living person, and there is no order to the ages of the generations. That basically means that just because you lived in an early generation doesn't mean you're going to live longer than a person in a later generation. So if we look at this chart, we can actually see that there's fluctuation. The first few generations get shorter and shorter, and once we get to Yered and Methuselah, we start living longer. Enoch, as we mentioned, his life got cut short. So there's no order to these ages. Now let's move on to the Samaritan Pentateuch. Just like the Masoretic text, the earliest complete texts of the Samaritan Pentateuch come from the Middle Ages, the 9th to 13th centuries. But just like the Masoretic text, we can find a Proto-Samaritan text found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What we're looking at here is a nice circular version of Exodus that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's called 4Q Paleo-Exodus M, and this is a Proto-Samaritan text, meaning it agrees with the Samaritan versions that came later. Now you might be wondering, why is this text a circle? And the reason is that it's a patch. There was a hole in the original scroll, and what somebody did was cover it up with a patch and then fill in the missing words. So let's take a look at the Samaritan Pentateuch's version of Genesis chapter 5. The flood was in the year 1307, 349 years before the Masoretic text's flood. That's more than a third of a millennium earlier. Nobody outlives the flood. Hence, Yered, Methuselah, and Lamech die in the year 1307. Big coincidence, all these people are dying at the year of the flood. There is an order to the ages in the Samaritan Pentateuch. It's that every single generation, for the most part, starts living less and less than the previous generations. And this really is a build-up to the next chapter, when Yahweh is going to say that man should not live more than 120 years. There's going to be an age limit to mankind. And what this basically means that Adam is the longest living living person at 930 years, and not Metushelach. So this is the Samaritan Pentateuch's version of Genesis chapter 5. Let's move on to the Septuagint. The most early manuscripts come from the 3rd to 5th century, such as the Codex Vaticanus seen here, but we also have even earlier snippets found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, such as here we have a piece of the Septuagint on the book of Leviticus, and you can see how it's written in Greek. According to the Septuagint, the flood occurs in year 2242, which is 586 years after the Masoretic Texts and 935 years after the Samaritan Pentateuch. That's almost a 1,000-year difference in when the flood took place. The general system of the Septuagint is that it takes the first years of a person's life found in the Masoretic Text, or sometimes the Samaritan Pentateuch, and adds 100 years to it. This is why the flood is so late. If you're adding 100 years into every generation, over time that equals about 1,000 years. There is no pattern to the ages in the Septuagint, just like the Masoretic Text, and in the Septuagint nobody lives past the flood, save for some manuscripts with Metushelach living 14 years past the flood, but those are probably a mistake. So we have 3 ancient witnesses to Genesis chapter 5. They all have different numbers. What are we supposed to do? Now there are really 2 options you could take. The first option is to choose one text and say that it is the best. Some people prefer the Masoretic text because it's clunky. There's no rhyme or reason to the ages. It doesn't really seem so ordered, which sounds like a real genuine genealogy. Others take the exact opposite approach and say no, the Samaritan Pentateuch's version is to be preferred because the biblical authors liked order, and it is very ordered. A lot of people die in the year of the flood, there's order to the generations, people start living less and less. So this text is to be preferred. And no one that I've yet seen actually prefers the Septuagint, probably because it's so clearly based on the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch, just with some changes. The next approach is to reconstruct a new text. This was the approach of Ralph W. Klein in a brilliant article named Archaic Chronologies and the Textual History of the Old Testament. This came out in 1974 and it's still great today. What Klein did is he looked at every number individually and looked among the 3 witnesses to see which number is to be preferred. Let's look at it, for example, our friend Metushelach. The first years of Metushelach's life. According to the Masoretic text, it was 187 years. According to the Samaritan Pentateuch, it was 67 years. And according to the Septuagint, it was 167 years. So which one is right? So Klein noticed that the Septuagint always adds 100 years to the Masoretic text. So the 167 here in the Septuagint, that means the Masoretic text should be 67, but it's not. However, the Samaritan Pentateuch is 67. So in this instance, Klein feels that the original number was 67, the Samaritan Pentateuch kept it, the Septuagint added 100, and for a reason to be explained below, the Masoretic text added 120. So in this case, the original number was 67. So what Klein does is he shows how 1, 2, or even 3 of the texts were making changes. So this leads to a 4th reconstructed original version of Genesis 5, and let's take a look how Klein reconstructs it. According to Klein, the flood occurred in the year 1342. There is no order to the ages. Metushelach is the longest living person. And finally, and most importantly, the last 3 generations, Yered, Metushelach, and Lamech, these 3 people outlived the flood. Metushelach for more than 2 centuries. So, according to Klein, the original version of Genesis 5 had 3 people outliving the flood. This is a major problem, and later scribes are going to try and fix this. And they're going to take one of 2 approaches. The Masoretic text and the Septuagint made the flood appear later. And if you make the flood much later, then nobody is going to survive. The Samaritan Pentateuch took the exact opposite approach. The Samaritan Pentateuch said, keep the flood where it is, just make the people live shorter lives. And that's why everyone was dying in the year 1307. They were dying the year of the flood. So you might be wondering, I've shown you 3 ancient textual witnesses, and I've shown you a 4th hypothetical reconstruction. So what do I think? How do I understand Genesis chapter 5? In order to answer this, I think there are 3 main points we have to go through. The first one is that every text was making changes to the numbers. They weren't making changes to the names, they weren't making changes to the orders, they were making changes to the numbers and the numbers alone. The second point is that the differences between the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch primarily concern the last 3 generations, meaning the 3 generations just before the flood. Finally, since we are dealing with a problem of numbers and the generations just before the flood, it makes sense that the numbers were changed because of the flood. So, I agree with Klein, But I'm not sure about his exact numbers, especially for Lemech, because there probably was some textual mistakes there that we can't really uncover. But for the most part, I think Klein has a brilliant approach to Genesis chapter 5. It's one of my favorite articles in biblical studies, and what it shows is how we can use the three ancient textual witnesses and try to come at an original pre-Masoretic text, pre-Samaritan Pentateuch, pre-Septuagint text of Genesis chapter 5. Now, if you like this kind of study and you're interested, this is called Textual Criticism. I highly recommend a book by Emmanuel Tov called Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible. This is an unpaid plug for this book. You can get it on Amazon, and I'll have a link below. And what this does is it shows you how to compare and contrast the different textual witnesses of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, that does it for our comment today. Let's move on to the verses. Today we'll be reading verses 23 and 24. Vayihi kol yemei Chanoch, and all the days of Chanoch were chamesh v'shishim shana u'shlosh me'ot shana, 365 years. Vayitalech Chanoch et Elohim, and Chanoch walked with God. Ve'einenu, and he was no more. Ki lakachoto Elohim, because God took him. That does it for the verses we're reading inside today. Let's move on to part 4, the picture. And the public domain photo that I chose to relate to this chapter relates to the 24th verse. Chanoch walked with God, that he was no more, because God took him. And here we see two people walking together. Okay, that does it for Genesis chapter 5. If you enjoyed this video, please like below, subscribe. Also, make sure to follow me on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and even on academia.edu. And I look forward to seeing you for Genesis chapter 6.